All right. So I want to show you guys a little bit of just information about classical education up here on the screen. ACCS is the Association of Classical Christian Schools, which you don't have to know anything about, but it is a great organization with tons of resources if you're ever interested. And we as a school rely on them a lot and learn a lot from them. And classical education in the United States, up until about 1900, everybody in the United States was educated classically. That was the only option, and it was a great option. And then with modernization, big philosophical changes in education started taking place. And then in about the late 1980s, a man named Douglas Wilson in Moscow, Idaho, you may have read some of his books, wrote a book called Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. And that was based on an essay written by Dorothy Sayers called The Lost Tools of Learning. He wrote this book because he had read Dorothy Sayers' essay and thought, well, what if you made a school that did what she's proposing in this essay? And he thought, well, I'm kind of crazy. I guess I'll try it. And he tried it and it proved very effective. And proved that a lot of other people were looking for something like that too. And so eventually, more and more people were finding out about his school and said, I want to be able to do that, but I don't know what to do. So he wrote a book, this book called Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. You can borrow one from me, you can get one on Amazon or buy it on your Kindle or something, but it's still out there and it's a great little book. And so a lot of schools started forming around these ideas. And so I would say our school is kind of in that heritage of schools. That legacy of what Doug Wilson is still doing up in Moscow, Idaho, and is done really beautifully. And so classical Christian education became a model of education that would help parents disciple their students. And a lot of parents are very much like you all, I think is pretty consistent, is that a lot of parents know they want a Christian education. Classical might sound pretty good, but what in the world isn't? How do we do it? And we certainly won't cover all that in the next 15 to 25 minutes, but we can maybe talk about just a couple little things that I hope will maybe be a little helpful to you. ACCS a few years ago the University of Notre Dame actually did a study for ACCS based on students who'd been educated classically, because now we have decades of data on these students. And the goal of classical education isn't really realized when a student is 18 years old. It's more when they're 38 and 48 and 58. That's what we're looking toward, is what kind of person are they becoming. And so you have to have all those decades in order to gather the data. So there's a ton of data. If you want to see the whole report, there's like a 50-something page report that was produced out of that independent study. But I thought I'd show you a little bit of the data that you might find interesting. Karen, thank you for getting this working again. I really appreciate it. Okay.
Do you need some more still?
I've got some here. Thank you very much. So one of the areas, and my screen gets cut off a little bit just when it displays it here, but one of the areas they studied in this study was life outcomes. And there's a lot more data than this, so I'm just giving you a little snapshot. But the yellow one here is classically Christian educated students. These are public, prep schools, Catholic, evangelical, and homeschool that they're being compared to. And this study was adjusted, statistical people can do amazing things. It was adjusted to only measure the influence of the school, not the family, but only influence of what was happening at school is how this study was done. And so after adult students who've been educated classically, you can just see, we won't go over the numbers exactly, but you can see the difference between classically educated students and others.
So the homeschool part, does that include classically educated homeschool?
That is a great question. I don't know. That is a really good question, but I'm not certain about that. Okay, so we'll just scoot through a few of these. This one is again on life outcomes. I feel helpless dealing with life's problems. So we're glad the yellow bar is small on that one, but you can kind of see the comparative outcomes there. Let me go on to the next one. For college and career readiness, these graduates were well prepared for college by their high school. And you can see their perspective on it. They're almost at the 90% level. And then as far as Christian practices, frequency of religious service attendance, which doesn't tell a whole lot about a student's heart, but it does tell about some of the fruit of their lives. And so you can see some of the differences there. And again, on Christian practices, obligation to take action against wrong or injustice. I think that's probably because they're equipped with tools to do just that. That's partly what a classical education does. Here's an interesting one. The Bible is an infallible guide for personal faith and behavior. You see the difference there. And then here's the last one I'll show you as far as being independent thinkers. This is trust in scientists, which is kind of interesting, just a little bit lower than a lot of other areas. Science and religion are mostly compatible. It's a stark difference there. And then the last one, errors in the Bible regarding science or history. And so if you ever want to see more of the study, it's online. I can point you to it. There's a lot of data just in the online format, but there's also that big long report. If you need to fall asleep one night, that might be good reading for you, okay? So let's come back to the question about classical education. What does it look like? Now, it's a big question that we can't deal with fully right here, but we are going to try to deal with it just a little bit, okay? And there are two things. There are lots of tools that I could give you for classical education, but let's talk about. I'll give you a couple tools. I like to refer to some of these old guys because they're the ones that we're drawing from to learn how to educate a child well. St. Augustine had this Latin phrase that he used called ordo amoris. Has anybody ever heard that before? Okay, it means, so this is ordered. You can kind of see our word ordered there. And if you know the song That's Amore, right? So you probably can figure out what this means. Loves, ordered loves is what this means. And so St. Augustine taught us that the formation of a child is about teaching them what to love and what order to love them in. When I talk with students about this, I say it's kind of like you might say, I love my mom. You might also say, I love pizza. There's a certain order those things should be in, and if you get them out of the order, life's going to go all wrong for you, okay? So the idea is teaching our children what to love, conversely what to hate, and in what order to love things rightly. So this is Augustine's great concept of rightly ordered loves. So that's one of our big goals. I love this quote from C.S. Lewis. I love every quote from C.S. Lewis, so you'll find we're going to talk about him just a little bit more. But I thought this was just high acclaim to you all. And he says the homemaker has the ultimate career. And he's actually speaking about moms and dads, people who make homes. We tend to think of homemaker as a pretty narrow term. But he was talking about people who make homes, who raise families. And he was talking about this in the context of what homemaking, what raising children means for all of civilization, how important it is. And so I hope you hear that, and I hope you really receive that, is that what you do actually matters for much more than from your family's life and the life of your child. It matters for all of us, how we raise children. And so, because I love C.S. Lewis so much, and because I think he has a great deal to say, I want to share with you just a little bit out of one of his stories. Have any of you read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader? Are you familiar with the story? Okay. Are you familiar with the Narnia stories? Yes. A little bit. Okay. So we're certainly not going to read this whole story, but in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, we meet the very opening line. I think is the best opening line of all the Narnia books. It's one of my favorite literary opening lines of all time. And it says, there once was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. So in the Narnia stories, the children, the Pevensey children, are some of the first we meet, they end up in this world called Narnia. They leave our world and they go to this world of Narnia. They become kings and queens in Narnia, and they meet the famous lion, whose name you probably know is named Aslan, okay? And so in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Eustace is a cousin to the Pevensey children. And they end up, through a magic picture in Lucy's room, they end up back in Narnia on a boat called the Dawn Treader, okay? And Eustace, though he hasn't been to Narnia before, and because he's only Eustace Clarence Scrubb and he almost deserves it, he's not like the other children. And Lewis very quickly tells us why he's not like the other children. He says he hadn't read any of the right books. So Lewis weaves a lot about education into his stories and other works, and he has very strong opinions about education. I don't know if you knew this, but Lewis and Tolkien were both at Oxford at the same time. They were very good friends, and they really fought a battle at Oxford and later Cambridge over the years in order to keep classical education intact at those universities many, many years ago. And so you see Lewis's opinions woven in here, and Eustace becomes a major figure in this story. So let me pick up the story where we find him. He's really annoyed by these Pevensey children, these children who've been in Arnia before. They don't get along very well. They're not too crazy about him either, but they do care about him because they see him as a true, he should be an Arnian, is what he is supposed to be, but he doesn't know that yet. And so they end up on this ship that's kind of close quarters, and they're all getting really annoyed. And so Eustace decides he just wants to get away. So he kind of slips away from the group on this island that they end up on. He's finally able to get a little distance from them. And he ends up on the edge of this cliff. He's looking down at this cliff, and there's not, if the book says there's not a bug or a bird or any movement, not even an insect in this whole canyon that he's looking down into. But all of a sudden, he sees a little cave, and he sees some smoke coming out of it. All right, some of you are nodding your heads like you kind of know the story. I'm going to read some of the story to you. And it says, something was crawling. Worse still, something was coming out of this cave. Now remember, Eustace is on a foreign island, all alone. He doesn't like anybody and nobody likes him. Edmund, or I love this next line again from Lewis. Edmund or Lucy or you would have recognized it at once. But Eustace had read none of the right books, so he didn't know, okay? So he looks down and he watches and he sees this dragon coming out of the cave. And so if Edmund or Lucy or you might have known what that meant, but Eustace didn't know what that meant. So he was in great, great danger. And then this next line is a great one too. But perhaps if he had known something about dragons, he would have been a little surprised at this dragon's behavior. The dragon comes out of the cave, he's kind of coughing and limping, and he makes his way over to his stream, and he falls over with his feet in his air, and he doesn't move. And Eustace doesn't know what's going on. He walks over and he touches the dragon, and nothing happens. The dragon has died. And just as that happens, a storm comes in, a big storm, and the only place to take shelter is the cave that the dragon had just come out of. So Eustace goes into the cave, and it's, of course, dark. This is a good story to tell after David's cave, right? I didn't think about those going together. But it's dark in the cave because there's no electricity, and he can't see, but he can feel what's there. And there are all these round things that are kind of cold. They're prickly things, and he doesn't know what it is, but he's excited and he's tired. So he lays down and goes to sleep. Again, Lewis would say that if he had read the right books, he would never have done such a thing. And so I'll give you, I think, just one more quote here. It says that he fell asleep, and it says he turned into a dragon while he was asleep. Sleeping on a dragon's hoard with greedy, dragonish thoughts in his heart, he had become a dragon himself. So when he wakes up, he doesn't know he's become a dragon. And he moves his foot, and the dragon's foot moves. And he moves his hand, and the dragon's hand moves. And he doesn't understand until he goes to a pool of water and looks in it and sees that he is the dragon. He has become this dragon. Here's a quote from another famous author who, this one is still Lewis. I have another one from G.K. Chesterton about the importance of stories. Since it's so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. And then in principle, this other quote from Lewis I use a lot. Education without values or virtue, as useful as it is, seems rather to make man into a clever devil. And so this is the point of the Eustace story. Eustace had gone to school, but he hadn't read the right books. He hadn't had a true education that is the formation of a soul. And so when he slept on the dragon's hoard, he turned into what he really was in his heart already anyway. He just became on the outside what he already was on the inside. And so you might have some little dragons in the making in your house, right? that we want to think about, how do we undragon them? I encourage you to read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. It's a beautiful story about how Eustace does eventually get undragoned. It's not a simple process, but it is a phenomenal story. So let's go back to our question. What does classical education look like? And I have another little quote. It's probably hard to read by Lewis on here, but he says this often in his books. What do they teach at these schools? And so I think that's probably your question. What are we talking about this with this classical education? What does this look like? So let's talk about a couple of tools. Abraham Kuyper was a Dutch theologian. This is one of my all-time favorite quotes. There is not a single square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry mine, including home and school days and every single day and everything that we talk about and teach. So let's look at a couple of things. There are two tools that I want to talk to you about. One of them is stories. We don't have a lot of time to spend much more time on the use of story. I wish we had time to have a real discussion about it. But I think you can see there's a lot of fruitfulness in reading the right stories. There's an author named James Taylor, not the musician. I like him too. There's a different James Taylor. And I listened to a talk of his a while back. If any of you want to listen to it, I'd be happy to share it with you. But he talks about how, a classical education is a great books education. And that means reading the great books of Western civilization so we can read the greatest things that have ever been written. But we don't read those until students are older. They're not quite ready. Most of yours aren't quite ready for the Iliad or for Aristotle or any of those. So we read them later. And he says the best preparation for the great books is reading the good books, of which Narnia would be one. When your kids are really little, fairy tales, Mother Goose, because there's a clear sense of good and evil and right and wrong and heroes and villains and virtues and vices. There's so much there to talk about related to human existence in these great stories of the Western canon. But guess what James Taylor also says is the best preparation for reading just the good books is encountering the real world, which just means go outside. Turn off all the stuff and let your kids be outside. And it's a crazy thing for me to try to convince parents that if you want your kids to do well on their senior thesis and well on reading Pilgrim's Progress in high school, have them go play outside right now. But the idea is that until they've encountered the real world and what thorns feel like and how mud works and how the stars look and all of those things, they don't understand the things that were written about in these books because that's what these writers were drawing from. So I encourage you in your school days, make time to be outside, make breaks, or just do school outside. Set up a hammock, set up a chair, have a picnic, send your kids outside, and let them encounter the real world as they take on preparation for reading good books and great books. And I can give you all kinds of lists for good books all day long. There are lots of good research. You want those? Okay, yeah, we'll talk about that here in a minute. And then another quick thing, stories we've already talked about. Here's this quote from Chesterton that I love. Fairy tales do not tell children that dragons exist. Children already know they exist. The fairy tales just tell them that dragons can be killed. And you want your kids to know that, right? You want them to know that these struggles they're going to face in life, they can be overcome. And that through Christ, he came to help us overcome these struggles. Okay, let's talk about this second tool that is a great tool of classical education. I would say a number one tool is cultivating your child's ability to think in and ask good questions. Andrew Kern, who's with the Circe Institute, says whoever asks the best questions wins. And I think he's probably right. That life is so much about the questions that we ask. I want to give you a couple practical questions to answer, to help your children cultivate. And you don't have to write this down. I can print this off or email it to you, and I'm happy to send this to you. It'd be the easiest way probably. So let me just give you a couple of questions for little kids to start with. I would say don't ever let go of these questions, but they're questions little kids can deal with. So it says grammar school on here. The I wonder questions foster imagination in our children. And these are just questions about how does it work and why does it work? Children ask those questions, they ask them all the time anyway. How does that work? And why does it work that way? And helping them think in terms of I wonder. I'll give you a great exercise to do with little kids. When you go outside, take a hula hoop on a regular basis. Maybe it's a weekly part of your school thing. Take a hula hoop, go outside, have your children sit down and sit there for 30 seconds. See if you can make it longer over time, but start with about 30 seconds and have them notice what they observe, see what they observe that's in their hula hoop. Just whatever is on the ground inside that hula hoop, and just talk about it with them. And just think about, I wonder about this, and I wonder about that. And just teach them to wonder about God's world. And these are the questions that as moms, you're tired, You're driving down the road and your kid asks you this random question and you're thinking about, oh, I need to put this thing on my list for HEB and I've got to go here and I've got to go there. I totally understand how all that works. But those are the moments when kids ask these kinds of questions a lot of times. They're usually at the most inconvenient moment in your day. I'm sure they watch. When is she going to be the most busy? And when am I going to ask her my deepest question of life? But those are the meaningful moments that you can capture of just wondering with your child about how the world works and why it works that way. And like I said, I would never let go of those questions, but as they get older, the questions will get bigger. And as they move into logic and rhetoric school, we take those questions and turn them into how can I know kinds of questions, moving beyond I wonder, and what can I actually know to cultivate their thinking. When they're little, you want to do some of that too, but maybe fostering imagination. As they get older, cultivating their thinking and asking them, they're going to make all kinds of claims as they get to be about 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. You know how this goes, right, with bigger ones. So they're going to make all kinds of claims. Ask them, what do you mean? Make them define their terms. What do you mean by that? No one talks to me at school, Mom. What do you mean by no one? Let's talk about that. What does that mean? And or ask them, how do they know? They'll make all kinds of claims. How do you know? How do you know if that's true? And dig into that with them. These are profound questions. These are Socrates level questions. This is what he asked people. What do you mean and how do you know? And so I just encourage you to make the most of asking these questions with your students. And so these are we just have a little bit of time and I want to leave some time for Q&A. But stories provoke great questions. Was this the right thing to do? Should this character have done that? Should Eustace have left the Pevensey kids? Should the Pevensey kids have responded to Eustace the way he did? Well, and if so, why or why not? How do you know? What does it mean? And asking those questions. You can do that with fables with your young ones. The small, you know the story of Androcles and the lion, the little mouse and the lion, the mouse rescues the lion. So the story's only written about that long. It's a super short little story. But thinking through what should have happened, what is right, what is wrong here, and how did this work? And asking those questions with your kids, I think, will be one of the most profound things you can do in keeping that dialogue of communication open. All right? There's a lot more to say about classical education that I wish we had time for. Maybe we should do this again and we can cover something completely different. Gives so much perspective, and I think that's why I love getting to do this. Because I've walked a lot of those miles where you've walked. I haven't done them perfectly. And by God's good grace, he's been very merciful and very kind. And they are actually pleasant, functioning adults. It has very little to do with me and very much to do with the grace of God. And so I think what we get to do is such a great privilege. And it is incredibly hard. As you know, you all are in the thick trenches of it. And I know that it's hard. And I know that it's kind of scary. And especially when you're homeschooling. When my homeschool years, I remember feeling like the whole weight of their entire life was on me in some ways. And it does feel like a huge responsibility. So I hope today will be a little bit of an encouragement to you.